So you turned out for a sermon on a dirty word. I'd better make it good. Which one are you hoping it is? Never mind. On our way to getting down and dirty, I want to start with a few headlines. Kind of like Jay Leno, only not funny. Congress in standoff over student loan interest rates. Congressional approval rating drops, and little wonder. It was at 9% last fall. Driving moderates out of Congress. As recess nears, little hope for breaking partisan impasse. And could Congress go from bad to worse after the election? Heaven forbid. And from the news, Americans are living through an era of disappointment. Now, I know some people think preachers should steer clear of politics. It is, as one writer put it, unlovely. A yucky business, mired down in questionable ethics and, maybe worst of all, money. A church cannot support any particular party or candidate without putting their nonprofit status at risk, but more importantly, I think they can't do it without implicitly also supporting some norms and practices that would have made Moses, Plato, and Jesus throw up their hands in disgust. You can take your pick among those three and others in this church. And I agree. The pulpit is for speaking about values and meaning, not siding with politics or political parties. However, I've never much cared for the kind of religion that stays tucked away inside a sanctuary either. One of the fundamental questions of religion is how we ought to go about living with one another in the world. And so when I see our country's elected leaders gridlocked and resorting to hostage-taking, I wonder what that means about how we're doing at that as a nation. One of the core principles of the Unitarian Universalist faith is support for the democratic process inside our churches and in society at large. If the process is jammed up in the halls of Congress, that is of concern to us as a people of faith, and it is jammed during one of the most trying times in recent history. The result is that morale is getting low out here on Main Street. Are you feeling the impact of our gridlocked Congress? Maybe in the economy? I know many of you are struggling with unemployment or underemployment. How about immigration reform? Some of you have come face to face with that dysfunction, I know. Or maybe in your feelings about the future. When will it get better? Is our political situation as bad as it seems? The political scientists and congressional scholars Thomas Mann and Norm Ornstein put out a book this year with the depressing title, "It's Even Worse Than It Looks." Mann and Ornstein have been watching Congress for over 40 years. Mann's with the Brookings Institute, a liberal-leaning research and policy institute, while Ornstein is with the American Enterprise Institute, its conservative cousin. What's interesting about these two guys is that they're working together. Brookings and American Enterprise are collaborating on the issue of election reform. When they put their voices together, they aim to represent a fair, nonpartisan political assessment. And so it was very eye-catching when Mann and Ornstein published an article in the Washington Post a couple of months ago with the headline, "Let's just say it, Republicans are the problem." Let me interject here that you probably won't be surprised to hear that I'm a pretty politically liberal person, but I am not what certain folks would call a knee-jerk liberal. I'm patriotic first. I believe deeply in our country's democracy, and that means I don't believe in demonizing people with whom I disagree, so that's not the direction we'll be going this morning. I think we should stay clear about the distinction between our values, our positions, and a political party, and more on that later. So while this headline was really eye-catching, my first thought was not that I ought to preach on it, but that there must be more to it coming from these scholars. There is. I personally have been very curious about how our country and our Congress became so divided and what we could possibly do about it. Sometimes I've even thought about going into politics myself, but what a mess. The constant fundraising and mudslinging and daunting obstacles to effective leadership, I'll bet it scares a lot of people off. Now, polarization is nothing new. Our country's political parties were also very polarized during the War of 1812, leading up to the Civil War, and during Reconstruction, when we tried to figure out how to recover and move forward. There have been bitter battles over federalism, which is the question of how much independence states should have from the federal government, and over slavery. But usually there's also been some leeway within the parties. Remember when there used to be such a thing as a conservative Democrat and a liberal Republican? Yeah? Today, those phrases sound oxymoronic, impossible. Nowadays, the most conservative Democrat is more liberal than the most liberal Republican. There's much more ideological unity within the parties and more of a gap between them. Today's polarization can be traced back to the 1960s. Now, if you're my age or younger, you've grown up in an era when Democrat is synonymous with liberal and Republican with conservative. But during the Civil Rights era, white Democrats in the South were some of the most conservative folks around. When they lost the fight over the Jim Crow laws and the Democratic Party began to reflect the values of its more liberal northern members, many Southern Democrats defected to the Republican Party. That began to reduce the overlap between the two. That was followed by the Voting Rights Act, and then Roe versus Wade solidified a conservative religious movement that has now become one of the most reliable core constituencies of the Republican Party. Migration patterns have influenced the parties. As retired folks moved south to warmer climates, the South became more conservative. Similar changes were happening in other parts of the country, too. The West Coast used to include many moderate Republicans, but the migration of racial minorities and the rise of environmentalism gradually turned the West Coast from red or purple to blue. Redistricting has played an important role. Politicians have redrawn district boundaries to make Republican or Democratic strongholds. Voters are packaged into zones that are as politically homogeneous as possible. And at the same time, studies show that people who vote tend to be more ideologically polarized than people who don't. That makes sense. Voting can be a pain in the middle of the week, in person, with a high rate of voter registration glitches getting in the way. In places where a voter ID is required, you have to track down all the supporting documents, birth certificate, government ID, and that often entails tracking down other supporting documents, proof of residency, other ID, etc., getting to the right government office, and there isn't one in every community, and paying the fees. So it's no wonder that the people with the strongest opinions are the ones who tend to show up at the polls. And the result is that politicians in narrowly redrawn districts benefit from catering not to centrists or moderates, but to their most extreme constituents. After all, the polarized people are doing the voting. These are some of the factors that have widened the gulf between the two parties. And correspondingly, now the stakes of each election are higher. The parties appear to have vastly different visions for our country. If there had been a shift in party control when we first came to Washington in 1969, right, Mann and Ornstein, it would have meant a move from one figurative 45-yard line to the other. Now it means a move from one goalpost to the opposite 25-yard line, or vice versa. Notice that they did not say it would be a move from one goalpost to the other, but from one goalpost to the opposite 25-yard line. That's because while both parties have moved farther away from center toward their extremes, Mann and Ornstein argue that one of the two parties is more ideologically extreme than the other. According to Mann and Ornstein, an insurgent right wing is drowning centrist Republicans out and making that party behave in ways that undermine basic values of American democracy, including cooperation, honest debate, and respect for differing viewpoints. That's the problem they were talking about in their headline. It would have been more accurate but less eye-catching if they'd said, Republicans have a problem and it's everyone's now, rather than Republicans are the problem. The country has watched as many incumbent Republicans lost their seats to radically conservative candidates in the last few years, and we've seen the Republican Party reluctantly embrace them. But according to Ornstein and Mann, one of the key turning points leading up to this problem happened nearly 30 years ago in the 1980s. At that time, the Republican Party was frustrated after 24 years of Democratic dominance in the House. They were trying to come up with a way to break the Democrats' stronghold there. Now, the public had its issues with Congress, but they tended to be attached to the incumbent leaders. How could they be convinced otherwise, they wondered. A handful of newly elected Republican lawmakers set in motion an ingenious plan that involved basically destroying the institution in order to save it. They devised a campaign to make the American public so disgusted with Congress that they would just throw the ruling party out. They united their party in publicly refusing to cooperate with the Democrats while denouncing them as the entrenched leaders of a corrupt institution. They lashed out at the Democrats, engaging in hyperbole that prompted Democrats to overreact and retaliate, and the plan worked. It got ugly. People got disgusted with Congress as a whole, and they voted out many of the sitting Democrats, replacing them with Republicans. So it was a very effective plan. But in the process, Congress's reputation with the public took a big hit. According to Mann and Ornstein, that unified strategy of non-cooperation from 3 decades ago is related to the ineffectiveness of Congress today and to the public's low opinion of our elected leadership. This unified opposition and divisiveness between the parties even shows up now on issues that have little or nothing to do with ideology, really, where you can't even figure out what a liberal or conservative opinion would look like naturally. For example, whether climate change is real. That should be a scientific question, not a partisan one. Remember the debt limit fiasco last year? That's another example. It's the one that prompted Mann and Ornstein to write their book. Although the debt limit has been increased regularly over the years under presidents from both parties, this time Republicans framed it as out-of-control Democrat spending, and they refused to make a deal unless it was attached to major consequences. Stan Druckenmiller, a staunch conservative hedge fund manager and an opinion leader, told the Wall Street Journal that he had no fear of a default. He was more uneasy about a deal between the parties that would compromise his ideology. So the most radical members and opinion leaders were using the real threat of a default to prove that they would not participate in Washington's business as usual. And because party unity is an important Republican value, going back to the 1980s, on this and other issues, moderate Republicans face a backlash if they diverge. As the deadline approached, Senate Republican leader Mitch McConnell pressed his colleagues for an agreement, explaining that he did not want Republicans on the line for a default, because if people stopped getting their Social Security checks and soldiers overseas stopped getting paid, it would eventually help Obama get reelected. The implied value there is not concern for the well-being of the American people, but the well-being of the party. Although it's obvious that Democrats also engage in bad behavior, in Ornstein and Mann's observations, most Democrats still favor compromise over deadlock. In contrast, they argue that the Republican Party today is uniquely beholden, at this moment in history, to a my way or the highway way of doing business. Whatever the case, it's easy to imagine the behavior catching on, especially with the issues of redistricting, obstacles to voting, and demographic shifts changing our political landscape. Compromise, once a cornerstone of American politics, has increasingly become a dirty word. And I'm worried that as extreme voters and legislators on both sides reinforce it in each other, non-cooperation will become less surprising and more of a norm to the rest of the American public. Look at the changes in mass media. Cable news is not held to the same standards of fairness that the old network news stations were, and many people now get their news only from their favorite partisan sources, which means we're not exposed to good quality debate anymore. Instead, we hear the politicians and commentators catering to those extremes. What a mess. Now, Unitarian Universalist churches may tend to lean politically liberal, but we are by no means politically homogeneous. This is not a sermon about one party being inherently better than the other. Just a glance back at how different parties looked in the civil rights era is evidence of how very little of their behavior is, at this moment in history, is inherent to them. So this is a sermon about thoughtful responses to conflict, dysfunction, and division. Ornstein and Mann propose some big fixes for our political system. They suggest mandatory voting to eliminate the trend that voters are more extreme than non-voters. They suggest making voting easier by eliminating roadblocks like voter IDs, by bringing the registration process into the 21st century. You still have to fill it out on paper and then it gets entered into a database. And by allowing people to vote near their workplaces or in popular shopping areas. They recommend campaign finance reform and rebalancing districts so that they don't sway so unevenly toward one party or the other. And they say they'd like to see the U.S. return to a culture of shaming politicians. Those who engage in egregious rhetoric that breeds division and distrust. Like the Times' Stephen Schwartzman, a billionaire in the financial industry, compared a proposed tax increase on the wealthy to Hitler invading Poland. Shame does have its role to play in society. In fact, Ornstein and Mann say our country needs opinion leaders from institutions like churches and universities to outspokenly denounce those who profit from lies and the media outlets that give them airtime and print space. Consider them denounced, Democrat and Republican alike. We need public square conversations that begin with assuming the basic legitimacy of others' viewpoints, not writing them off as a threat to our ideologies. Underlying that is a basic orientation toward conflict and debate. We've forgotten how to do these things very well as a society. That's why we don't talk politics with our neighbors, and we cringe when they put up their yard signs at election time. What would a good public square conversation look like? Perhaps similar to a well-conducted debate or disagreement in your personal life. People would bring a spirit of curiosity to the conversation. Instead of arguing the merits of one position over another right away, they'd ask how the other party came to feel as they do. What motivates them? What is of utmost importance to them? We would bring a different goal to the process. Have you ever started a conversation about politics with someone who feels very differently than you and felt hopelessly frustrated right at the outset? Yeah. I'm not going to be able to convince them, you told yourself. I'm never going to win this. That's part of the reason we avoid those conversations in the first place, right? But in a good public square conversation, you can go ahead and forget about winning, at least for most of it. Make it your goal instead to understand your opponent very, very well, how they arrived at their conclusions, what values underpin them, and then share similarly about your own views. Decision makers who engage in this kind of conversation would also do their best to be unconditionally constructive. That means they'd be on their best behavior, no matter what the other party does. No bridge burning, no retaliation, just modeling a constructive approach to differences. In this way, even if it gets rocky, the relationship itself is treated with respect, and it has the potential to strengthen. When it came time to discuss possible solutions, they'd separate the people from the problem. They wouldn't engage in mudslinging or character assassination because they would know that such behavior gets in the way of problem solving. Each party would feel they'd been heard and were respected, and would not feel that collaborating with those with whom they disagree would be compromising their values. And both parties would be open to the right kind of compromises. In the classic text on negotiation, Getting to Yes, Roger Fisher and William Ury suggest dispensing with the word compromise altogether. They agree that it's kind of a dirty word. They recognize its negative connotation, the idea that reaching a compromise means compromising oneself, or that in a compromise, no one gets what they want. They suggest working toward a negotiated agreement instead. a negotiated agreement. That's an agreement based on addressing the interests of both parties. To do this, you have to tease apart positions and interests. A position might be something like a mandate or no mandate that employers cover birth control. But the corresponding interests might be the separation of church and state or reducing unplanned pregnancies. With the interests, there's more leeway than yes and no. While you cannot simultaneously mandate and not mandate that employers provide birth control coverage, it is possible to devise a mandate that honors the separation of church and state while reducing unplanned pregnancy. So interests are easier to work with than positions, and that's why we have to talk with each other instead of at each other. If all of this sounds idealistic, well, it's no more out of reach than many of Ornstein and Mann's suggestions. It's a call for a culture shift. It's about restoring dignity and good character to human relations. And I can't think of any better venue than a church to talk about that. And I can imagine churches joining universities and other institutions, as Ornstein and Mann suggested, to persuade voters and political leaders to get on board. I want to invite the band to come back up. When Jesus' disciples asked him how they would know a true prophet from a false one, he said, "You shall know them by their fruits." The same is true of churches. A good church bears fruits of connection, goodwill, and neighborliness. It builds up the greater good. Which makes me wonder, as we approach this next election year, how can we contribute to a healthier democracy? What kind of public square conversations could we help to make happen? Who would we invite to be our conversation partners? I'll bet you have some ideas. I can't wait to hear them.